In the 1760s, Boston stood as one of Britain's most vital colonial strongholds. Ships crowded its harbor, merchants built fortunes on Atlantic trade, and beneath the surface of daily commerce, something dangerous was beginning to stir. Within a single generation, this thriving port would ignite a revolution that would echo across centuries. Using AI reconstruction technology, I'll bring these historic paintings and engravings to life, shifting perspective through scenes in ways impossible when they were first created. We'll move through Boston's streets, rotate around its landmarks, and step inside moments that shaped a nation. Before we begin, I want to make you a promise. By the end of this journey, you'll see Boston not just as history on a page, but as a living place where ordinary decisions carried extraordinary weight. And we'll compare these reconstructed scenes to how the same locations look today, revealing what time erased and what somehow survived. Our story begins not in Boston itself, but on the open Atlantic. This painting captures the Winthrop fleet arriving in Massachusetts Bay during the summer of 1630. Looking at these vessels, imagine the uncertainty aboard each ship. These settlers carried tools, supplies, and ambitions, but no guarantee of survival. The coastline ahead offered nothing but possibility and risk in equal measure. John Winthrop led this expedition with a vision he called a city upon a hill, a settlement that would serve as an example to the world. He couldn't have known that his small colony would become the birthplace of revolution, but standing on that unfamiliar shore, every choice they made would ripple forward through generations. Moving through this reconstructed scene, we can see Boston taking its first uncertain steps. This engraving shows the town's original meeting house, built in 1632, just 2 years after settlement. The structure was simple, almost crude by later standards, yet it stood near what is now State Street, placing the colony's earliest gathering point exactly where modern Boston's financial district pulses today. The meeting house wasn't just a building, it was the heart of decision-making, worship, and community survival. In a settlement where starvation and disease were constant threats, this space represented something more valuable than shelter. It represented order, purpose, and collective will. As we transition deeper into the colonial period, notice how Boston begins to transform. This image shows the town decades later, still small but no longer fragile. Wooden structures line muddy streets. Ships anchor close to shore, their masts creating a forest against the skyline. Daily life unfolds at a pace we can barely imagine today. Looking at this reconstruction, I find myself thinking about ambition. These colonists arrived with almost nothing and built something that would outlast empires. They couldn't see the future, but they moved through each day as if it mattered, and in ways they couldn't comprehend, it did. By the early 1720s, Boston had evolved into something recognizable. This engraving captures the city from the harbor, and the transformation is striking. Where once stood a desperate settlement, now rises a legitimate port town. Church steeples mark distinct neighborhoods. Wharves extend into the water like fingers reaching toward opportunity. In the foreground, you can see Boston Harbor crowded with merchant vessels. These weren't just ships, they were the economic lifeline connecting this colonial outpost to the wider Atlantic world. Sugar from the Caribbean, manufactured goods from England, timber and fish sent outward. Every transaction strengthened Boston's importance and deepened its dependence on British trade networks. This 1743 engraving gives us a clearer view of Long Wharf, one of Boston's most critical landmarks. Moving across this image, notice how the wharf extends dramatically into the harbor, reaching farther than any surrounding structure. This wasn't accidental. Long Wharf was engineered to accommodate the largest ships, allowing them to unload directly onto Boston streets. For arrivals from Europe, this was often their first solid ground after weeks at sea. Imagine stepping onto these wooden planks after a transatlantic crossing, feeling land beneath your feet again, surrounded by the chaos of a working port. This moment represented both ending and beginning. One journey finished, another about to start. Rising behind the waterfront, several church steeples define Boston's skyline. The most prominent is Christ Church in the North End, later known as Old North Church. Completed in 1723, it served Boston's Anglican community long before becoming famous for revolutionary signals. Looking at it here, it's just another church, ordinary, expected, unremarkable. History has a strange way of transforming the mundane into the mythic. Within 50 years, lanterns hung in that steeple would warn of approaching British troops, triggering a midnight ride and a day that changed everything. But in this moment, it's simply part of the architecture, woven into daily life without drama. Rotating our view toward the harbor entrance, we encounter Boston Light. Built in 1716 on Little Brewster Island, this was America's first lighthouse. For ships approaching after long Atlantic voyages, this beacon often provided the first confirmation that navigation had been successful, that Boston lay ahead, that the gamble of crossing had paid off. The original structure stood for 60 years before British forces demolished it during their 1776 evacuation. They demolished it deliberately, denying its use to the Americans they were abandoning. But the site was too valuable to remain dark. By 1783, a rebuilt lighthouse stood in its place, and remarkably, that structure still guides ships today. Just beyond the lighthouse sits Castle William, the military fortress controlling access to Boston Harbor. Positioned on Castle Island, its cannons commanded the narrow approaches to the city. This wasn't decoration, it was a statement of power, a reminder that Boston existed within a larger imperial framework that could protect or punish as circumstances required. Looking at this fortress from the water, visitors immediately understood that Boston was a controlled space. You entered on British terms, you traded under British oversight, and ultimately, you lived subject to British authority, whether you welcomed it or not. Crossing from the harbor back to land, we arrive in Cambridge at Harvard College. This view shows the institution as it appeared in the early 17th century, long before it became a global university. 3 buildings define the yard. Harvard Hall on the left, used for instruction. Stoughton Hall at center, providing student housing. And on the right, Massachusetts Hall, completed in 1720. Of these 3 structures, only Massachusetts Hall survives today. It stands as Harvard's oldest building, a direct physical link to this colonial period. But looking at this scene, it's worth considering what Harvard represented. This wasn't just education, it was the deliberate cultivation of colonial leadership, training the ministers and magistrates who would govern Massachusetts Bay. In some ways, Harvard was more subversive than any protest. It created a class of educated colonials who could read British law, understand British philosophy, and eventually question British authority using Britain's own intellectual tools. Revolution often begins not with anger, but with literacy. Moving back into Boston proper, we encounter the Old State House around mid-century. This building served as the seat of colonial government, the space where laws were debated, taxes imposed, and royal authority enforced. Proclamations were read from its balcony to crowds gathered below. Decisions made inside these walls directly shaped colonial life. Today, the old State House still stands, now surrounded by modern towers. But in this period, it dominated its surroundings, a physical manifestation of governmental power. And as tensions escalated toward revolution, this building would transform from administrative center to symbolic battleground. Just nearby lies Boston Common, captured here in the late 1760s. This was one of the city's oldest public spaces, used for grazing livestock, public gatherings, military drills, and casual recreation. British soldiers regularly trained here, a constant visible reminder of imperial military presence. In the background stands the Province House, official residence of Massachusetts royal governors. From here, British appointees oversaw the colony, enforcing Crown policy while navigating increasingly hostile public opinion. The Common itself seems peaceful in this reconstruction, but peace was becoming more difficult to maintain. Walking across this space in 1769, you might have watched British regulars drilling while colonists went about their business. The tension wasn't always obvious. Days passed without incident, but the potential for conflict saturated every interaction, a pressure everyone felt but few openly acknowledged. We cannot explore pre-revolutionary Boston without stopping here. December 1773, the harbor at night. This scene shows colonists boarding ships and dumping British tea into the water, an act of deliberate economic sabotage disguised as protest. Some participants dressed as Mohawk Indians, partly to conceal identity, but also to frame the action as distinctly American rather than British. This wasn't called the Boston Tea Party yet. That name came later, sanitizing what was actually property destruction carried out in defiance of law. Looking at this reconstruction, notice the careful choreography. This wasn't mob violence, it was organized resistance, planned in advance, executed with discipline. The message was clear. British authority over colonial commerce was no longer accepted. The cost of enforcement had just risen dramatically. Behind actions like the Tea Party lay networks of coordination and planning. One critical node was the Green Dragon Tavern, shown here as it appeared in the 1760s and early 1770s. This was far more than a drinking establishment. Its private rooms hosted meetings where merchants, craftsmen, and political organizers gathered to debate British policy and coordinate resistance. The Sons of Liberty met here regularly, using the tavern's semi-public nature as cover for what were essentially planning sessions. Revolution didn't begin with grand declarations. It began in spaces like this, where ordinary people shared grievances, tested ideas, and built the social networks that would eventually support open rebellion. Nearby stands Faneuil Hall in 1775, already known as the Cradle of Liberty. The building served dual purposes. The ground floor operated as a market. Above it, a large hall hosted town meetings where Boston citizens debated issues affecting their lives. By 1775, Faneuil Hall had become a pressure point. Meetings grew larger, arguments more heated. The gap between colonial expectations and British policy widened until compromise seemed impossible. In this space, private frustration became public opinion, and public opinion hardened into collective action. Moving through this reconstruction, imagine the hall packed to capacity, voices competing, tempers rising, the air thick with tension and possibility. These weren't professional politicians, they were merchants, artisans, sailors, people with businesses and families who saw their world shifting beneath them and decided they had to act. Now we jump forward to 1789. The revolution is won. Independence is secured. This image shows a triumphal arch erected in Boston to welcome President George Washington, leader of the new nation he helped create. The arch was temporary, built specifically for this occasion from wood, but finished to resemble stone. The illusion of permanence mattered. Only years earlier, these streets had been filled with protest and conflict. Now they were dressed for celebration, transformed from battlefield to stage for national theater. For those present, Washington's visit represented validation. The revolution had led somewhere. The colonies were no longer fighting to become something. They were something. Standing beneath that arch, watching the president pass, they witnessed proof that their gamble had succeeded. We return now to Old North Church, completing a circle that began decades earlier. Built in 1723 as a quiet Anglican congregation, it served its community without drama for 50 years. Then, in April 1775, 2 lanterns appeared in its steeple, signaling that British troops were moving by sea toward Lexington and Concord. That signal triggered Paul Revere's midnight ride and the battles that followed. What had been an ordinary church suddenly became part of revolutionary mythology. Looking at these reconstructions from different periods, we can see the building remain constant while its meaning transforms completely. Before we finish, I want to bring you into the present and show you how these locations look today. Boston's first meeting house once stood along what is now State Street. The wooden structure is gone, replaced by modern commercial towers. Nothing marks the site where the colony first gathered. History has been paved over, built upon, absorbed into the rhythm of contemporary finance. The 1720s harbor view showed Boston as a low, crowded port town, shaped entirely by the sea. Today, that shoreline has been filled, extended, and transformed. Where ships once anchored now stand skyscrapers, but the harbor remains Boston's heart, still defining the city's character even as its form has changed. Boston Light still operates from Little Brewster Island, rebuilt after its Revolutionary War destruction. It remains America's oldest continuously used lighthouse site, a rare direct link between colonial infrastructure and modern navigation. Castle William's walls still stand on Castle Island, overlooking a transformed harbor. Damaged during the British evacuation, rebuilt by Americans, it now serves as a historical site rather than an active fortress. The guns are silent, but the stone endures. Harvard's Massachusetts Hall survives as the campus's oldest building, still in use after more than 300 years. Of the 3 structures in our colonial-era view, only this one remained, housing students whose educational experience bears almost no resemblance to what occurred here in 1720. The old State House sits surrounded by modern towers, nearly unchanged in appearance, but completely transformed in context. What once dominated its surroundings now appears small, preserved as a museum inside a city that grew far beyond what its original occupants could imagine. Boston's Common remains a public park at the city's heart, no longer grazing land, but still shared commons, still a gathering place, still central to civic life. The usage has changed, but the fundamental purpose endures. Faneuil Hall still stands on its original site, surrounded by crowds once again. They're no longer debating independence, but the building continues serving as a gathering point, marketplace, and symbol of public discourse. Old North Church still rises above the north end, its steeple visible across the modern cityscape. The neighborhood has closed in around it, but the church remains recognizably itself, a colonial landmark persisting inside a contemporary metropolis. Walking these locations today, you experience a strange double vision. The past is simultaneously present and absent, marked and erased. Some structures survived, most didn't, but the geography persists, and with it the memory of what happened here. Boston transformed from fragile settlement to revolutionary crucible to modern city across 4 centuries. The ships that crowded its harbor in 1720 are gone. The empire they served collapsed, but the essential character of the place, its role as a crossroads of ideas, commerce, and change, that somehow remained constant through all the transformation. Thank you for joining this journey through Colonial Boston. If you have thoughts or suggestions for future historical reconstructions, I genuinely appreciate hearing them. Until next time.